The first thing they noticed was that the forest had gone quiet. No birds, no wind, even the distant sound of axes had died, as if the trees themselves were listening. In that silence, the smell crept up from the ground: old oil, coal, metal, and something sour that didn't belong to the living world. It caught in the back of the throat and refused to leave. Every man in the clearing felt it at the same time, and none of them needed to say what they were thinking. The war was over, but something from it was still here. The axe head struck again, and this time the sound was wrong, not the dull thud of wood or the scrape of stone. This rang sharp and hollow, like a bell buried underground. The youngest logger froze, his hand still wrapped around the handle. He looked down, then slowly dropped to his knees and brushed away the leaves with bare fingers. A curve emerged from the soil, smooth, unnatural, painted once, long ago, in a grey-green color that the forest had tried and failed to erase. A color no one had used for anything peaceful. Metal, someone whispered. Another man stepped back instinctively, crossing himself. The black forest had swallowed plenty of things over the centuries, but this felt different, heavier, like uncovering a grave without a name. They worked carefully now, not because anyone told them to, but because something inside them demanded it. Dirt gave way to rivets. Moss peeled back from aluminum skin. The shape grew unmistakable, undeniable. A wing, twisted, scarred, but still proud in its line. And there, half consumed by rust and roots, a faded cross clung to the surface like a wound that never healed. A fighter plane. No one spoke the name, but everyone knew it. A Focke-Wulf. A wolf in the woods. The forest seemed to exhale. They stood there for a long time, 6 ordinary men staring at a relic that should not have survived them. None of them had been pilots. None had worn a uniform worth remembering, but all of them had lived through the war, and all of them carried memories they didn't like to touch. This wreckage pulled those memories out by force. They didn't know yet whose plane it was. They didn't know how long it had slept beneath their boots, but they felt it immediately, the sense that this machine had not simply fallen. It had been placed. Chosen. Winter 1944. The sky over southern Germany had become a hunting ground. Fuel was scarce, pilots scarcer. Young men climbed into cockpits that smelled of sweat and fear and told themselves they were ready. Among them was Unteroffizier Lucas Adler, 20 years old, with hands that still remembered farm tools and eyes that had not yet learned how to stop hoping. He had grown up near this forest. As a boy, he ran between the trees until his lungs burned, pretending he was faster than anything that could chase him. When the recruiters came, they spoke of wings and freedom and honor. They never mentioned the weight of responsibility or how quickly freedom turns into obligation when the engine starts. The wolf they gave him was powerful, temperamental, alive in a way machines rarely are. When he pushed the throttle forward, it answered like a predator unleashed. He loved it instantly. He trusted it. And on that cold morning, he climbed into its cockpit, believing it would bring him home. The radio crackled with urgency. Enemy aircraft approaching. Scramble orders came fast, clipped, emotionless. Lucas didn't ask how many. He didn't ask where the others were. He simply rolled down the frozen runway and lifted into a sky that had already decided his fate. High above the forest, the world shattered. The first impact came without warning. The plane jolted violently, metal screaming as something tore through the fuselage. Smoke flooded the cockpit, thick and choking. Instruments flickered, then went dead. The radio dissolved into static. Lucas tasted blood where his teeth cut his lip. He fought the controls, heart hammering, breath ragged. The wolf was wounded but still flying, barely. He knew the drill. Bail out. Save yourself. The forest below stretched wide and dark, an endless cushion of trees. Then he saw the village, his village, snow-dusted roofs, the narrow road that led past his family's house, the church spire rising through the mist like a promise. He did the math instantly, instinctively. The plane would not clear it. The wreckage would fall where people lived, where children slept. The choice arrived without ceremony. Lucas pulled the stick. The maneuver tore the last strength from the engine. The wolf screamed, then dropped, clipping treetops, branches exploding around it. The forest rushed up, not violent, not forgiving, simply there. The impact was brutal and final, swallowed by earth and roots and silence. No explosion followed, no fireball, just a scar in the ground that the forest began closing almost immediately. The village heard something that day. They always said they didn't, but windows rattled, dogs howled, and somewhere Mother looked up from her kitchen table with a feeling she never managed to name. The forest kept the secret. For 80 years it held on to twisted metal, faded paint, and a story no one told out loud, until a wrong sound under an axe broke the silence and the past pushed its way back into the light. They did not call the authorities that first day. No one said it out loud, but every man there felt the same unease, the same instinct to leave things alone. War relics were not curiosities in that forest. They were ghosts. And ghosts, once disturbed, had a habit of demanding attention. They covered the exposed wing with branches before they left, as if tucking in a wounded animal. That night, none of them slept well. The smell clung to their clothes. Dreams came heavy in crowded engines, roaring, trees splintering, a sense of falling that never quite reached the ground. One man woke, convinced he'd heard a plane pass overhead, low and angry, though the sky outside his window was empty and still. By morning, the secret had already begun to leak. A neighbor noticed the mud on their boots. Another saw the gray-green paint flaking on a jacket sleeve. In a village that had survived by learning when not to speak, silence was rarely accidental. By noon, everyone knew something had been found in the woods. By evening, the old men had started shaking their heads before anyone even finished the sentence. They remembered that winter. They remembered the sound. Back then, the war had pressed in from every direction. Fuel convoys burned on the roads. Aircraft clawed at the sky day and night. The forest was both shelter and threat, somewhere to hide, somewhere danger might come from without warning. When the noise came that day, sharp and tearing through the air, people froze in doorways and fields, waiting for impact, but it never came to the village. Instead, the sound moved lower, closer to the trees, then vanished into a dull, final thud that seemed to sink into the ground itself. No explosion followed, no fire. Just silence heavy enough to hurt the ears. Soldiers arrived hours later, asking questions with eyes that didn't want answers. They searched the forest briefly, found nothing obvious and left. Officially, a pilot had gone missing. Unofficially, everyone understood what missing meant, and so the forest kept its secret, and the village learned to live around it. When the authorities finally came this time, decades later, they came gently. A small team, no uniforms meant to impress, just historian's engineer, a man with white hair who carried a notebook thick with names. They walked the path quietly, as if afraid the trees might change their minds. The covering was removed piece by piece. More of the aircraft emerged, fuselage crushed inward. One wing sheared almost clean off, the other twisted like it had tried to claw its way free. There was no sign of fire. The forest floor beneath was dark but calm, earth packed hard by time. The cockpit drew everyone's attention. The canopy had collapsed, frozen in the shape of that final moment. Inside, the seat was empty. For a brief, dangerous second, hope stirred. He bailed, someone said softly. The engineer shook his head and pointed. The harness buckles were still locked. The straps lay exactly where they would have been, untouched. There was no sign of a parachute release. No human remains either. The forest had taken those. They worked slowly, cataloging each piece. The serial numbers were faint but readable. The notebook came out. Pages turned. A finger traced a line and stopped. Adler, the white-haired man, said. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Lucas Adler. Declared missing, December 1944. The name moved through the group like a breath. An old woman standing at the edge of the clearing pressed a hand to her mouth. She had been a girl then. She remembered Lucas. Everyone did. He had ridden too fast, laughed too loudly, waved from his bicycle, as if the world were never going to ask him for anything serious. No one had ever said what they suspected. You didn't survive by saying such things. But hearing his name spoken here, over twisted metal and wet leaves, felt like closing a door that had been left ajar for a lifetime. They found a helmet wedged behind the seat, cracked along one side. Inside, the leather was worn smooth from use. A map lay folded in the storage compartment, edges darkened, ink smeared beyond recognition. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just the small, ordinary artifacts of a man who expected to land somewhere and continue living. As the sun dipped lower, the forest changed. Light filtered through the trees in long, thin beams, catching on metal edges and making them glow briefly before fading again. It felt wrong to leave the wreckage exposed overnight, but it felt worse to rush. That evening the village gathered without being asked. No speeches were planned, no flags were brought out. People stood in small clusters, hands in pockets, eyes fixed on the trees. Some stared at the ground, as if expecting the forest to open and offer more answers. Others looked up, scanning the sky, imagining a single aircraft limping home through hostile air. A man who had been a child during the war spoke at last. His voice trembled, not from age but from memory. He turned. He said, "I always believed that." No one asked what he meant. No one needed to. The forest rustled softly, branches shifting as the evening wind moved through. It sounded, for just a moment, like an engine cooling after a long flight. They began the recovery at first light, when the forest was still wrapped in mist, and the ground held the cold from the night. There was no machinery allowed beyond the path. Everything would be done by hand. It felt like the only acceptable way. Metal straps, wooden braces, slow, careful movements. Each piece lifted as if it might crumble or accuse them. As more of the aircraft came free, the story it carried grew clearer. This was not the wreckage of a man who had lost control in panic. The impact angle was shallow. The trees closest to the crash site were clipped cleanly, their scars still visible beneath decades of growth. He had guided it in, deliberately. The realization settled heavily among the workers, deepening their silence. Word spread beyond the village. Journalists called. Requests came in from collectors, museums, men who spoke of value and rarity. The answers were brief and firm. This was not for sale. This was not an object. It was a place where a decision had been made, and no price could be put on that. The notebook man returned to the archives and dug deeper. He found Lucas Adler's training records. Average marks, no disciplinary actions. A note from an instructor written in neat, restrained script shows unusual awareness of surrounding, thinks beyond procedure. It read differently now. Another file surfaced. An unsent letter, folded once and never sealed. Lucas had written it 2 days before his last flight. He wrote about the cold, about how the engine felt stronger than ever when pushed hard. He wrote about the forest, how flying over it made him feel anchored, not trapped. He apologized for leaving without saying goodbye properly. He said he'd be careful. He did not mention fear, but between the lines it lived. The letter was read aloud in a small room with the windows closed. No one interrupted. When it ended, there was no comment. Some things did not require response. As the recovery continued, villagers came with their own offerings of memory. A woman brought a photograph of Lucas as a boy, standing beside a bicycle too big for him. A man recalled seeing the aircraft that day, low and damaged, banking away from the village with a sound he described as angry but controlled. Another admitted he had gone into the forest years later, searching, and turned back when the silence became too heavy. The forest, it seemed, had chosen who it spoke to. The cockpit was removed last. The canopy shattered when they tried to lift it, breaking with a sharp crack that echoed through the trees. Everyone flinched. Inside, beneath layers of dirt and leaves, they found the control column locked hard to one side, frozen in place by time and rust, by will. The engineer ran his fingers along it, slow and deliberate. He was flying until the end, he said. They transported the largest sections to a temporary shelter near the edge of the forest. There was talk of restoration, of display, but no one spoke of making it whole again. It felt wrong, like erasing the truth of how it had ended. That night, the village held a quiet gathering. No official ceremony, just people drawn together by something older than protocol. Candles flickered in jars along the path leading into the woods. Children asked questions their parents struggled to answer. Older men stared into the dark, their faces lit by small, unsteady flames. An elderly woman stepped forward. She had known Luca's mother, had sat at her kitchen table after the war, listening to grief that had nowhere to go. Her voice was thin but steady. She waited, the woman said. Not for his return. For understanding. The forest answered with a low sigh of wind through branches in the weeks that followed. Something changed. Visitors came, not in crowds, but singly or in pairs. They walked the path slowly, stopping where the earth still bore the faint outline of impact. Some left flowers, others left nothing but footprints that faded quickly. The wolf became more than a relic. It became a question. What would you do with seconds to decide and everything you love below you? The village began planning a small marker, nothing grand, just a name, a date, a truth that did not shout. There was debate, quiet but intense. Should they mention the aircraft, the nation, the war? In the end, they chose simplicity, because that was what the forest had taught them. As the marker was placed, the sky darkened with approaching weather. Clouds rolled in low and heavy, pressing down on the treetops. For a moment the air felt charged, alive. Someone looked up, half expecting to see a single aircraft break through the gray, limping but defiant. Nothing came, only rain, soft at first, then steady, soaking into the ground where metal had rested for decades, washing away the last traces of oil, leaving behind earth, roots, and a story that no longer belonged to the forest alone. The rain changed everything. It fell for 3 days without pause, turning paths into narrow streams and pressing the forest down into itself. Water found its way into every hollow the aircraft had left behind, filling the scar, until they looked almost intentional, like shallow graves meant to be noticed. Work stopped. The recovery site was left alone, watched over by mist and the low, patient sound of rain on leaves, and in that pause the past grew louder. In a small house at the edge of the village, a man in his late 70s sat at a table and stared at a photograph he had not touched in years. He had been 16 in 1944, old enough to be afraid, young enough to believe fear could be outrun. The photograph showed a group of boys by the river, laughing, sleeves rolled up. Lucas Adler stood among them, taller than the rest, already half gone from that world. The man's hands shook as he folded the picture back into its envelope. He had seen the wolf that day. He had never told anyone. The memory came back with brutal clarity. He had been cutting through the forest with a bundle of firewood when the sound tore. Overhead ragged, uneven, nothing like the confident roar he was used to hearing. He looked up just in time to see the aircraft burst through the clouds, trailing smoke, flying far too low. It wobbled, corrected, then banked sharply, straight toward him. The boy dropped the firewood and ran, heart pounding, convinced the plane was coming apart in the air. But it didn't. It held together long enough to pass overhead, so close he saw the pilot's helmet through the canopy. A face, pale and set, eyes forward, not panicked, focused. Then the aircraft veered away, climbing just enough to clear the slope, plunging deeper into the trees beyond. The boy never moved again until the sound was gone. Later soldiers came, later still rumors. And after that, silence. He told himself it wasn't his place to speak, that what he had seen didn't matter, that the war had taken enough already. Now, as rain tapped against the window, the truth felt heavier than it ever had. When the weather cleared, he walked to the forest. The marker was nearly finished. The path lined with wet leaves glistened in the weak sunlight. A few people stood nearby, talking quietly. He waited until they drifted away, then stepped forward and placed the photograph at the base of the stone. "I saw you," he said, his voice barely more than breath. "You turned." The forest did not respond, but something in him loosened. The recovery resumed slowly. Smaller fragments were collected, bits of instrument glass, torn wiring, a bent piece of metal that might once have been part of the fuselage or might have been nothing at all. Each piece was treated with the same care. Each one mattered because it had been there. The cockpit section was moved to a conservation lab. As it dried, more details emerged. Scratches on the interior frame, a notch cut into the metal near the seat, someone's private mark, made out of boredom or superstition. 3 short lines, 1 long. No one knew what they meant, but everyone agreed they had not been made by chance. The engineer found something else, tucked behind a panel, a small cloth pouch, worn thin. Inside was a ring, simple, unadorned, the kind worn by someone who didn't expect it to be noticed. There were initials scratched inside, nearly erased by time. L.A. The ring was returned to the village, not to be displayed, but to be kept. Where exactly, no one said. It was enough to know it was no longer alone. As autumn deepened, the forest began to change color. Gold and rust replaced green. The crash site blended back into its surroundings, less visible each day. But people still came. Fewer now, more deliberate. A teacher brought her class and spoke not of nations or aircraft specifications, but of choices. She asked the children to imagine making a decision that could not be undone. Some of them nodded, understanding more than she expected. The village council received a letter from a museum in the city, offering space, funding, attention. The letter was polite, persuasive. It spoke of preservation, education, legacy. They declined, because the wolf did not belong behind glass. It belonged where the decision had been made, where the trees still leaned inward as if listening. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills, a low-flying aircraft passed far overhead. Civilian. Modern. Its sound was smooth, distant, almost gentle. People paused in the street, looking up out of old habit. The plane passed on. The sky closed, and in the forest, beneath roots and fallen leaves, the last traces of oil finally disappeared, leaving nothing but earth, memory, and the quiet understanding that some stories do not end when the engine stops. Winter returned to the forest softly, as if unwilling to disturb what had already been settled. Snow came in thin layers, whitening the paths and muffling sound until footsteps felt intrusive. The marker stood half-buried now, its edges rounded by frost, the name still clear. People brushed it clean when they passed, not out of obligation, but because leaving it covered felt wrong. With the cold came visitors who had never been there before. Not tourists. Pilgrims of a quieter sort, veterans who had outlived their uniforms, children of men who never came back, a few former pilots, their movements slow, their eyes sharp, in ways that had nothing to do with age. They stood in the woods longer than anyone else, listening to a sky that offered nothing in return. One of them spoke at last, voice dry as leaves. That machine was unforgiving, he said. You had to mean every movement. No one asked how he knew. The way his hand moved, instinctively tracing an invisible control column, said enough. As the year turned, a historian from the city arrived with a different question. Not about the aircraft, about the village, about why no one had spoken before. The answer came from many mouths, none of them defensive. Because silence had been safer. Because memory could be dangerous. Because not every truth was ready for daylight when it first happened. The historian listened, then closed his notebook without writing anything down. In the lab, the cockpit continued to give up small details, mud pressed deep into corners where no foot should have reached, tree bark embedded in the metal frame. evidence of how deep the forest had closed around the wreckage, holding it tight. Through storms, seasons, years, the control column remained fixed, defiant even under careful attempts to move it. In the end, they stopped trying, let it stay where he left it. A local carpenter built a simple wooden cradle for the cockpit, not polished, not labeled. When it was returned to the forest edge for temporary shelter, people gathered without being called. They watched as it was lowered gently into place, breath held as if the past itself might crack under the weight. It didn't. That evening, a young man stayed behind after everyone else left. He stood in front of the cockpit, hands in his pockets, snowflakes collecting on his coat. His grandfather had died without ever speaking of the war. Not once. The silence had passed down like an inheritance. He leaned closer, peering through the shattered canopy. "I would have been afraid," he said quietly. "I don't know if I could have done what you did." The forest answered with nothing, but the admission lingered, honest and raw. Spring came late that year. When it did, it brought a kind of urgency with it. New growth pushed up through old scars. Flowers appeared where metal had rested. Life, indifferent and persistent, reclaimed its ground. The village council met again, this time with fewer doubts. They agreed on a small annual gathering. No fixed date, just a promise that once a year, when the forest felt ready, they would walk the path together and remember. Not the war, the choice. On the first walk they moved slowly, children up front, elders behind. Someone carried the photograph, someone else carried the ring, wrapped in cloth. They did not speak until they reached the marker. A breeze moved through the trees, lifting leaves, stirring the canopy overhead. For a brief moment the sound rose and fell, deep and rhythmic. Several people looked up at once, hearts quickening. Then it was gone. As they turned to leave, a child tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Did he win?" the boy asked. She knelt, thought carefully, then shook her head. "No," she said, "but he did something better." The boy frowned, trying to fit that into his understanding of the world. That night, the forest slept under stars, the same sky Lucas Adler had once climbed into, believing in the strength of his machine and the certainty of return. The wolf remained where it belonged, not as a weapon, not as a trophy, but as a reminder carved into earth and memory. And slowly, the village learned that remembering did not reopen wounds, it closed them. The forest changed again. The summer, the storms came early. Thunder rolled through the hills without warning, sharp and close, sending people indoors and flattening the tall grass in seconds. One afternoon, lightning struck less than 100 meters from the marker, splitting an old pine clean down the center. The sound was violent, final. When the echoes faded, the forest stood altered, as if something long-standing had finally broken. The next morning, someone noticed the path had shifted. Roots torn loose by the storm had lifted the soil, revealing a shallow channel running from the crash site downhill. In its exposed earth, something pale caught the light. Bone. Work stopped immediately. The clearing filled again, quieter than before, heavier. The authorities returned, this time with expressions that carried no curiosity at all, only respect. They worked carefully, slowly, as they had the first time. What they found was not much. Time and soil had done their work, but there was no mistaking it. Lucas Adler had not left the forest after all. Part of him had stayed, cradled by roots and rain and years of silence. The village gathered again, but this time the mood was different. There was no tension now, no unease, only a strange sense of completion, like a sentence finally reaching its end. An older man stood apart from the others, watching the careful movement. The same man who had placed the photograph at the stone months earlier. His secret no longer felt like a burden. The forest had spoken for him. The remains were handled with care, not as evidence, but as a person. A simple box, no spectacle, no hurry. When they lifted it, the wind moved through the clearing in a long, low breath, stirring leaves, bending grass. Someone removed their hat, then another, then everyone else followed. The decision of what to do next came without argument. Lucas Adler would not be moved far. He had chosen this place once. It felt wrong to deny him again. A small burial was arranged near the marker, just beyond the reach of roots. No military display, no uniforms, only villagers, a few historians, and one former pilot who stood very straight despite the years. A short passage was read, not from scripture but from the unsent letter. The words sounded different now, less hopeful, more resolved, as if they had been waiting for this moment to land. When the box was lowered, the forest was utterly still. Then, somewhere high above, a single bird crossed the clearing, wings beating slow and steady. Someone exhaled a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Afterward, life resumed in its quiet way. Children returned to the path. Leaves fell. Snow came again. But something had shifted, not in the forest, but in the people who lived beside it. The story no longer felt unfinished. The cockpit was moved once more, this time closer to the marker, not displayed, just present. A piece of the past allowed to age in public rather than hidden away. Rain marked it. Sun warmed it. Seasons passed over it like hands smoothing a blanket. A visitor one afternoon asked why they hadn't restored it, made it whole, made it impressive. An old woman answered without hesitation, because it was never whole again after that day. That autumn, the village school added a new walk to its curriculum. Not a lesson, they insisted. A walk. Children learned where to step, where not to. They learned how the forest changes without asking permission. They learned that history is not always loud or proud. Sometimes it is quiet and asks you to come closer. On the final walk before winter, a boy lagged behind the group. He stopped at the cockpit and placed his hand on the cold metal. It felt heavier than he expected. "Thank you," he whispered, unsure who he was thanking. The forest answered with the sound of wind through branches, steady and unremarkable. But the boy stood there a moment longer, feeling that something had been passed to him, not a burden, but a responsibility. And far above, unseen and unheard, the sky remained wide and empty, holding no record of the choice that had once been made beneath it. Time began to move differently after that. Not faster, not slower, just differently. The forest no longer felt like a place that held its breath. It breathed freely now, seasons flowing into one another without tension. People noticed it in small ways, how birds returned earlier in the spring, how the wind no longer seemed to stall at the clearing, how footsteps along the path sounded lighter. The story of the wolf spread beyond the valley, carried not by headlines but by quiet retelling. A teacher mentioned it to a colleague. A visitor spoke of it to a friend. No one exaggerated, no one needed to. The truth, left alone, was enough. One afternoon a man arrived alone, walking with the deliberate care of someone measuring every step. He was not German. His accent, when he eventually spoke, placed him somewhere across the channel. He stood before the marker for a long time, reading and rereading the name as if committing it to memory. Later, at the small cafe in the village, he introduced himself to no one in particular. He had been a pilot too, not in that war his father had been. "My father flew that day," he said quietly. He never talked about it. But once, after he'd had a bit to drink, he said there was a German aircraft he couldn't bring himself to follow down. The room stilled. He said it was damaged, flying low, and then it turned away from a village, he said. He said it felt wrong to chase it after that. No one asked for proof. No one challenged him. The story settled among them not as confirmation but as connection. Two men in the sky. Strangers bound by a moment neither of them had fully understood at the time. The visitor returned to the forest before leaving. He placed a small stone near the marker, stepped back, and saluted not sharply, not formally, just enough to be seen. As the years passed, the cockpit weathered further. Paint flaked, metal dulled. Moss began to creep along its edges. No one stopped it. Decay was not an enemy here. It was a continuation. A debate arose briefly when someone suggested adding a sign, something explanatory. dates, context. The village listened, then declined again. Those who need explanations will ask, someone said. The rest will feel it. On a warm evening, long after the last visitor had gone, a group of teenagers gathered at the forest edge. They lay on their backs in the grass, watching stars appear one by one. Someone pointed out a plane crossing high above, a blinking line of light moving steadily across the sky. It must be nice, one of them said, flying now. No one trying to kill you. Another shook his head. Still a lot of responsibility up there, he said, surprising himself. They fell silent, thinking about that. The village held its annual walk again, this time smaller, quieter. The photograph was no longer brought. The ring remained hidden. They had served their purpose. Memory had taken root on its own. At the marker, no one spoke. They stood together, listening to the forest, feeling the ground under their feet. When they turned back, they did so without ceremony, without regret. Later that night, a storm passed nearby, distant thunder rolling like a reminder rather than a threat. Rain never reached the forest. The air stayed clear. In the morning, sunlight cut through the trees at an angle that illuminated the cockpit just enough to catch the curve of the wing, still proud in its line despite everything. A shape meant to fly, grounded forever by choice. The wolf had become something else now, not a weapon, not a relic, a witness, and the forest, having held its silence for so long, seemed finally at peace with what it had been asked to keep. On the last evening of that year, the forest stood under a sky so clear it felt unreal, as if someone had wiped away the noise of the world and left only what mattered. Frost edged the leaves. Breath showed in the air. The path to the marker was empty, but not abandoned. It never was any more. A man walked it alone, slowly, hands clasped behind his back. He was not old, not young, the kind of age that comes from carrying responsibility rather than years. He stopped at the cockpit, resting his palm lightly on the weathered metal, feeling the cold seep through his skin. He closed his eyes. For the first time he imagined the cockpit not as it was now, silent and broken, but as it had been then, alive with vibration, gauges flickering, the smell of fuel and frost and fear. He imagined the pressure of the control stick, the weight of the decision pressing harder than gravity. Above him, the stars burned steadily, indifferent and eternal. In the distance, a modern aircraft passed, its sound faint and smooth, nothing like the ragged roar Lucas Adler would have heard. It crossed the sky without hesitation, guided by systems that made such choices almost unthinkable now. The man followed it until it vanished. He thought about how close the world had come to forgetting this place entirely, how easily the forest could have kept its secret forever. How many other choices like that lay buried, unmarked, unnamed. The village slept. No one dreamed of explosions. No one woke in fear. The war had loosened its grip here, finally, not because time had passed, but because understanding had arrived. When man turned to leave, he noticed something new at the base of the marker. A small wooden carving left some time during the day. Crude, unmistakable, a bird with wings spread, carved by an unsteady hand. No name, no note. He smiled, then placed it carefully beside the stone. Winter deepened, then eased. Years followed, gentle and unremarkable. The cockpit sank further into the earth, embraced by moss and leaves. The marker weathered, but the name remained legible. People came and went. Some stayed longer than they intended. Others left quickly, unsettled in ways they couldn't explain. The forest did not mind. It had done its duty. One spring morning, long after the men who first found the wreckage were gone, a school group walked the path again. A child asked why the plane was never fixed. The teacher paused, then answered honestly. "Because it's already complete," she said. "Just not in the way we usually mean." The child nodded, accepting that without full understanding it. That was enough. Above them, the sky was wide and blue, empty of threats, full of possibility, and somewhere between earth and air, between past and present, The memory of a single turning aircraft remained not as a symbol of war, but as proof that even in the worst of times a human choice could still bend the path of history quietly and forever. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe the past still speaks when we take the time to listen, then subscribe to Red Maps World War II and keep these memories alive.